Hello, welcome to our third online lecture. This week, you guys have been reading about and answering questions on the Industrial Revolution, and also you've been looking at and will be looking at economic philosophies like socialism and capitalism. For our lecture, we're also looking at the Industrial Revolution, the impact that it has, and we're going to examine capitalism and socialism kind of in depth, right? Just like last week within the lecture, that you need to answer and submit with the rest of your work on Friday. The normal assignments, the ones from Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday, they are a classwork grade, just like we've been doing, and the discussion question goes in as a quiz grade. So it's important that you do that as well and put appropriate effort into it. Some people last week forgot to do the discussion question, and I had to email a lot of people about that. And some people who did it, I don't think put in maybe the amount of effort that you should, knowing that it's a quiz grade. Right? Kind of a way to help out some of you who have a lower test average here before the year ends. All right. Like I said, this week we're looking at the Industrial Revolution. All right, we're going to be looking specifically at England. That's really where the Industrial Revolution starts, as you've already seen in some of the assignments we did even earlier at the beginning of digital learning. The Industrial Revolution starts in England largely because of the abundance of coal that they have there as a resource and the ability to power the steam engine with that coal. We'll also look at Germany briefly. You'll have an assignment for that next week. We're going to go a little more in depth. I will mention how the United States is very early on, one of the earliest nations to industrialize, really kind of Great Britain or England first, and then the US. But then we see Germany and Japan as kind of this exception to industrialization, because typically what we see is industrialization is a process that takes quite a bit of time to complete. But Germany and Japan are going to be really smart in their approach to industrialization, and they will go through it much more quickly than other nations, and in a lot of ways in a more successful way than some of the other nations that attempted to industrialize or did industrialize. All right. But like I said, we're starting in England. It says after the political revolutions of the 1700s and early 1800s, so things that we've seen already, right, with the Enlightenment leading to revolutions for democracy, like the American Revolution or the French Revolution. Another type of revolution began, and this is the Industrial Revolution. It says it's the shift beginning in England during the 18th century from making goods by hand to making them by machine. So kind of seems like a simple thing, right? No longer making goods by hand, but instead they're being produced by machinery, right? And typically you're seeing large factories being built, large numbers of machines in those factories producing the goods. And this leads to a new level of mass production, right? And the impact from this is huge. If you watched the crash course on Monday, as you were supposed to, he kind of did a really good job explaining that, where so much of the modern world we're used to is really only possible because of the changes that started here during the Industrial Revolution. Really, cover all year, there are two time periods that have the most significant impact and lead to the most change. The first one was Unit 1, the Agricultural Revolution. The fact that people learned how to farm, and therefore they didn't have to be nomadic anymore. They could settle in one place, and they had a dependable, reliable food source, an abundance of food for the first time. So it allowed cities to be built, it allowed population to spike, huge numbers of changes. Now here, the Industrial Revolution would be the second thing that causes the most change, brings about the most change, because it completely changes the way people live, the way that life goes, the expectations of what people could have. Right, mass production of goods makes them cheaper and more widely available. We see a huge number of inventions taking place here as well. Right, and really like modern technology and everything we're so used to in our lives, all only possible because of this. So it says begins in Britain when the wealthy people bought up farmland and aimed to improve farming techniques. So it actually starts on the farms. This was the major industry, so it's starting there, looking for improvement to be more efficient. Because if you could be more efficient on the farm, what did that mean? Well, it meant you didn't have to hire as many workers. Maybe you could produce even more food than you could before with less workers. So that means your costs are lower. You're not paying as many people. And if you're producing even more food, then you can make even more money. All right, so it's just a way to try to improve profit on the farms. It says new, larger farms called enclosures were created, and on them, farmers discovered better ways to farm. One of the early examples, and we're not going to get into a bunch of them, but one example is Jethro Tull invented the seed drill, which allowed for crops to be planted in a straight line very quickly. The machine is actually creating a hole, a divot, dropping the seed, and then you just have someone following behind the seed drill, covering the seeds back up with soil. So it takes what could have been a job for many farmers out in the fields, digging a hole, planting a seed, covering it up one by one, and makes it something that you just have maybe one or two farmers guiding the seed drill, because it's usually pulled by a horse, and then you have one or two following behind it, covering the seeds up. So again, a huge way to improve efficiency on the farm, and therefore the land. But let's think about, well, that's positive for the landowner. What effect would that have on the workers? Well, we said you don't need as many farmers. So there's not as many jobs available in the countryside anymore. What are those people going to do? Well, their only choice is going to be to move to cities where these factories are being built and try to get jobs in the factories, right? And that's important when we start talking about those factories in a minute, that people don't really have a choice other than to try to get a job in those factories, because there's simply not as many jobs in the countryside anymore. All right, here you see an image of the seed drill, right? Horses pulling it. You got two farmers up there guiding the horses. You got one following behind to cover up the seeds that have been planted. And the seeds drop down those channels there. They're planting rows of seeds at a time, not just one. Okay, some other inventions that will spur industry. We see the textile industry, which is clothes, clothing and materials like that. That's really going to excel in England and Britain. That's something they become known for. So you see inventions like the flying shuttle and the spinning jenny, which made that just much more efficient. Again, that's just a quick mention. You see them here, flying shuttle at the top, spinning jenny below it. And then incredibly important is not really the invention, but the improvement of the steam engine. You see James Watt develops a better, more efficient steam engine. Sometimes people say, oh, he invented the steam engine. It's not technically correct, because the steam engine already existed before this. It was really only used, again, in the crash course he mentioned, it was only used really on coal mines directly, because that was the only place that they had enough coal to power the early steam engines. And what did they use it for? Well, they used it in the mine to try to pump water out of really deep mines so that they can continue mining. So they burn a lot of coal because it allowed them to have access to much more coal. But the machine was so inefficient, if you weren't next to a coal mine with that excess amount of coal, you wouldn't be able to power it. Like, you're not putting this on a train or a boat or anything like that. It used way too much coal, so you wouldn't be able to bring enough to actually use it. Until James Watt develops a much more efficient system that needed much less coal to operate, and therefore starts being used to power machinery, steamboats, trains, machinery in factories, all of the above. All right. Okay, and you see a diagram for his steam engine. We also see an American inventor, Robert Fulton, will be the first to put the steam engine on a boat. The Clermont is the ship. This becomes a really huge thing, obviously, for shipping and moving goods around. You see in England, canals were built to improve and quicken transportation. So man-made canals so that these ships could move around more, bring more goods for trade. Obviously, England had an advantage here, being an island, plenty of water access to ship goods and move goods around also. See that roads were improved by adding crushed rock over a layer of big rocks for drainage. Because otherwise, previously to this, yes, there was carriages. People were being pulled by horses and carriages along roads, but they were just dirt. So there's a lot of stories about how if it rained, these would just turn to mud and transportation stopped, travel stopped. Right now, that didn't necessarily have to happen. You see the Clermont here. Even more important, though, than the steamboats for industrialization is going to be the train. Right? The steam engine, the train, becomes basically the symbol of industrialization because it was so efficient. These trains could pull such large loads of goods that were produced, or materials to produce goods, either to the factories or from the factories. So nations that were industrializing are going to focus heavily on railroads because of how efficient they are, how much they can carry. This was the way to power the industrialization. So it says they became the most important method of transportation during the Industrial Revolution. Why? They could move heavy materials quickly and cheaply. People did use them for transport as well. All right, along with industrialization, we see a huge movement of urbanization. It says in the late 1700s, more and more people moved to the cities. Why are they moving to the cities? Because remember, jobs are no longer really available in the countryside. So to find work, people had to move to the cities. The problem here is you have all these new factories with jobs available. What is the goal of the factory? Producing some good and to make money for the factory owner, right? And this is in a time period where there were no laws in the economy in these major nations like Great Britain or America to protect workers. The government did not get involved in the economy. That was the ideal, right? Pure capitalism, free market. Government doesn't make any laws. So what does that mean? What would you not have? Well, you wouldn't have things like minimum wage. You wouldn't have a set amount of hours that someone could work a week. You wouldn't have child labor laws. None of that would exist. All right. So you have all these people rushing to the city competing for jobs, more people than there are jobs. A lot of jobs in the factories, but not enough. So if there's an abundance of workers, more than there are jobs, that gives the power to the factory owners. And they were able to pay really low wages, have factories where the conditions were really poor and dangerous, and people didn't have any choice, right? If you want a job, you better take those wages, even if you think they're too low, right? Because of course the factory owners are going to do that if they can. That's how they make more money, right? Same thing still happens today. Why does so much production happen overseas in places like India and China instead of in America? Because you can pay the workers less there. And if you can pay the workers significantly less, then the overall cost of production is much lower. I mean, you can make a lot more money when you sell your good. All right, so this is called urbanization, with all the people moving to the cities. Cities were typically built near water, both for shipping and for the fact they could produce energy from the water. People moved to cities to find jobs in factories. Urbanization, city building, and the movement of people to cities, it occurred because of the factories, like we said. We see England will see a boom in cities like London becomes the most important industrial city, still incredibly important. In England, Manchester as well was the northern city of growth. All right, so two very prominent cities in England still today. Due to the speed that cities grew, services were not always available. So because so many people were moving in so quickly, they didn't have everything, the infrastructure that they needed, right? They didn't necessarily have enough housing for people. Not enough apartments or homes were built, so you see very cramped housing. A lot of times you don't see any sewers built, so what happens to the waste? Well, a lot of it just kind of sits in the streets and is among the people. And you would think, well, they would have learned their lesson from the bubonic plague. Not really. Right? There's going to be a lot of problems with disease here as well. Trash collection. There was no established trash collection. There's no companies large enough to collect all the trash. So again, a lot of it just sits in the streets. Causes a lot of problems with disease. This one should be kind of shocking, right? In London, life expectancy during this time for a factory worker on average was 17 years old. On average, people lived to 17. How? Well, because the conditions of the cities were so poor. No sewers, no trash collection, housing was cramped. There was no real regulation on the apartments and things. They didn't have any way to make sure there were fire exits. So if one of these apartment buildings caught on fire, a lot of people died. Right? There were things causing the life expectancy to be so low. Also, the factories they work in are incredibly dangerous, and that's lowering the life expectancy significantly as well. You're working incredibly long hours, 6 days a week in a factory. That's dangerous. So a lot of exposure to things that could be deadly. Then we see, okay, not much better. Well, it is significantly better. We might not think of it as good by today's standards, but if it's 17 in the cities, the average life expectancy for a farmer in England in this time period was 38. So you might think, well, that's still really young, and it is by today's standards, but that's a lot better than 17, right? So there's a clear difference. That shows you how dangerous the cities were if they are that significantly impacting the average life expectancy. It says factories were dark and dangerous, often poorly lit. You might have sitting puddles. The machinery was usually very unsafe because there was, again, no regulation from government that said, hey, machinery has to be safe to operate. Gears have to be covered up. They have to be tested for safety. Nothing like that happened, right? And we said there are no child labor laws, so you had kids working in the factories on machinery that was built for an adult. So a lot of times the kids are not big enough to operate it. So they're like standing up on boxes, operating machinery that is not made for a child. And you could see how things would be worked 14-hour days, 6 days a week. The only day they would have off was Sunday, right? Because you could go to church on Sunday. Conditions were poor. Many workers were often injured or killed on the job. And it's not like today again. Nowadays, if you get hurt on the job, right, workman's comp comes in and you are usually paid for the fact that you were hurt and you're not able to work at that time, right, until you're healthy enough to work again or whatever it might be. Now, back then, you get your hand caught in machinery and your arm is broken, and your wrist is broken, whatever, you lose your hand. Even if it's, let's just say your arm's broken, you don't get workman's comp. You're not paid while you can't work. And even worse, the factory doesn't want to wait for you to come back. If you're a factory worker, that's something they could probably train someone to do your job in 2 days easily, right? So there's plenty of people out in the streets who wanted work, so they would just give the job to someone else. If you get hurt in the factory, it just means you don't have a job anymore. And the government is not helping you out while you're unemployed. No unemployment, right? Or if you get sick and you miss a day of work, there are a lot of accounts of people who missed 1 day of work and they didn't have a job when they came back because people were waiting outside, so they hire somebody else. This goes for the men and women. It goes for the children as well. A lot of factories preferred to hire children because they could pay them less. Women and children, you paid less than an adult male. So if they could do the job, you would rather hire them. That was kind of the mindset. All right, here you see a picture of typical expectation for housing in this time period. This is a normal apartment, right? And this is not the living room, this is the whole apartment. You see a bed there, you see a cot on the side, right? And you see a lot of people living under this roof. It's not a family of four, right? A lot of times you have 3 generations of grandparents, their kids, and the grandkids all under one roof. Maybe they have 4 kids or so because more kids meant more people could work, potential for more money, right? And there's no bathroom here, there's no kitchen. There's actually, you can't really see it in this picture, but there's a small little stove on the side. That's all they would have. You kind of see the silverware hanging above it. And then there would be a shared bathroom for every level of the apartment building. A lot of times you're talking about 5 or 6 apartments sharing that one shared bathroom. That a lot of times would be one shower, one toilet. So, if you have brothers or sisters and you get annoyed about sharing the bathroom at home or how long your sister's in the shower or whatever, this would be much worse, right? You see kids here. They look very young because they are, right? A lot of times these kids are probably, around 10. And they're covered in the smoke from the coal mining. And a lot of kids were employed in the coal mines because they were small, and the idea was they could get very easily into tight spots within the mine to lay dynamite that could then be blown up to expand the mine. So more people could get in, more work could be done. That's a very dangerous job. Mining underground in these mines, especially laying dynamite, things are very uncertain. A lot of times the mines do collapse and people are killed, right? So it's a very dangerous job, but it was a job that a lot of kids were hired to do, right? And they look young, right? Because they are. That means they're not in school, they're not receiving an education, they are focused on work from a very young age. They're still working the 14-hour days just like everyone else, right? Here you see kids in a textile factory, same kind of thing, but you see they're standing up on the machinery that is too big for them. That kid doesn't even have shoes, so he's standing on the crates. Again, you see the huge spinning gears right next to him, the belt right next to him. You could see how this could turn dangerous pretty easily, right? Just one slip, that's all it took. Or his clothes that's really baggy getting caught in something. Okay, so injuries like that were very common in the workplace. And then you see here a kid with an overseer in the factory a depiction of it obviously, but a kid who's being beaten for not working hard enough or being distracted during the day. This kind of thing was very common as well. And this is not something where he could go home and his parents would be mad at the factory owner because their kid got beaten at work. Who do you think, what would happen if he went home and it was clear that he'd been beaten at work? He'd probably try to keep it a secret. But if they found out, they're going to be mad at him because the fear is if you're not working hard and they're having to do that to try to motivate you to work, well, then you could be in danger of losing your job. And if the kid loses their job, then the family very well may not be able to afford their apartment or afford food. All right, so they needed the kids to have their jobs as well because wages were so small. Just your parents working would not be enough. All right, now that all sounds really negative, understandably. There are positive impacts of the Industrial Revolution as well. Here we see that nations became wealthy. Clearly huge growth in wealth for nations that industrialized. This is a difference maker in history. The countries that industrialized versus the countries that failed to do so, you can clearly still see the impact today. And it's a direct reflection of how advanced the country is today is usually due to when they industrialized or if they failed to. Because the countries that do industrialize are going to very quickly start taking advantage of the countries that had not. All right. It created jobs. well, they might not sound like great jobs yet, but they will improve. And that was the only option at the time. They raised the standard of living again over time. Yes, it was really bad in the cities at first and for a while, but it will improve and then eventually be better than ever before. Created demand for educated workers to help with the designing machinery, designing factories. Items that had previously been luxuries because they were hard to produce now became common. Cities became better places to live again over time, and living and working conditions will improve over time. We will see a spread of the Industrial Revolution. The U.S. is one of the first countries to industrialize after Great Britain. Very early on, we had the same resources that England had, coal and things like that we had access to. So during the War of 1812, when we went to war with England again, not the American Revolution, but a second time we went to war with them, they kind of stopped wanting to trade with us, obviously, because they were fighting with us. And that really pushed the U.S. to start manufacturing our own goods. Right? So it really kind of kicked us on the right path to where we started producing a lot and eventually become a powerhouse in industry. Right? So that's very successful for the U.S. also. Now, two nations that I mentioned that industrialization will not be a long process of trial and error and things that succeed and things that don't, but more a very quick industrialization, not literally overnight, but kind of in comparison, it seems like overnight, are Germany and Japan. And the reason they're able to industrialize so quickly is, like we see here, Germany, they will copy what England. Well, there's already a blueprint of how you industrialize, what works and what does not. So they will actually pay huge wages, 5 times, 6 times normal wages to hire workers from England to convince them to come to Germany so they can teach them how to operate it, how to run everything, right? So they're convincing them to move there by offering tremendous wages. We see Japan will do the same thing, right? Convince experienced workers who know how this works to come to their country and teach them how to do things, right? Even if it's a heavy cost, it's worth it easily. Right, so Germany will follow the British model and bring English workers to Germany. They'll build a lot of railroads to help speed up their growth. Germany is a lot more landlocked than England, not as much access to water, so the railroads are even more important there. And they become definitely the focus. All right, and like I said, you're going to have an assignment on Germany next week, so I'm not going to get too in-depth there right now. We see ideals of the Industrial Revolution here as well. Laissez-faire economics, which means hands-off. Hands-off economics. The government is hands-off, letting industry and business set working conditions without interference. Government should not interfere in business. That's the idea. That government should stay out of it. They should not interfere. All right, Adam Smith will defend the idea of a free economy in his book, The Wealth of Nations. So he is a supporter of capitalism, a supporter of laissez-faire economics, that the government should stay out. It's not a place for government regulation, right? That's not the purpose of government. If you think back to last week, we talked about, and there's a debate over what is the purpose of government. Is it to enforce laws to make society safe? Is it just to help people achieve things and try to guarantee their natural rights? Depends where you fall on this, would also impact how you feel about economics. Right? Usually they're going to kind of go hand in hand. Now, in this book, he wrote about 3 laws of economics. He said that there's a law of self-interest, and this is important. Right? According to Adam Smith and according to capitalism, he says the motivation for people to work hard is their own self-interest. Why do people go to work? Why do they want to make money? Well, I guess that's actually kind of hand in hand for capitalism. Why do people go to work? Why would they work hard? Is to make money, according to capitalism, for their own self-interest, so they can have a good life, a nice home, they can provide for their family, whatever it might be. Right? But the motivation, the reason people work hard is for their own self-interest. Right? And that might seem, in the U.S. and with the mentality that exists here, that might seem obvious, but that's not the only opinion. We'll see a differing one in a second. Now, the U.S. is not a pure capitalist country. Right? A lot of people think about the United States and think, oh, we're capitalists. We lean that way. Historically, we used to be pure capitalists, but we have become a mixed economy where we're somewhere in between capitalism and socialism in the world, or somewhere in between the two today. History has kind of shown us that a mixed economy works best. Right? But it's really a decision of, along that line of being mixed, where do you fall? Do you lean more capitalist? Do you lean more socialist? And that's a debate constant. That's the biggest debate in politics, right? For the U.S. and really anywhere is, should we implement more socialism? Should we pull back on it? Where that falls is very difficult to decide, right? And if you look at politics in the U.S., your typical mindset, I guess you could say it's stereotypical, but what proves to be true is that Typically, Republicans are more conservative, which means they support being more capitalist, which is this, Adam Smith, government staying out of business, less regulation, let business owners run their businesses. Where Democrats support a more socialist mindset, not full socialism, but more where the government would be a little more involved, right? A little more controlled by government in businesses. All right. Now, so his 3 laws on economics. The first one was law of self-interest. That's why people work hard, for their own self-interest. Second, the law of competition. Competition forces people to make a better product, right? Why do people produce the best product? Why can the government stay out of it? And how can you still guarantee that you'll have the best possible product? Is competition. Competition, they say, should exist, needs to exist in the economy. And what would that mean? Well, like, real easy example is Apple and Samsung. These companies are supposed to push each other to produce maybe the best phone possible. And technically, they're supposed to push them to have it available at the lowest possible price, because that's what people are going to want to buy, is the best product at the most competitive price. Now, maybe a company produces a better product than their competitors, but if their competitors are cheaper, then the law of competition says that people should buy the cheaper product, or will. The majority of people will buy the cheaper one. There are exceptions to that, right, that we see. I'd say Apple is kind of an exception. It's gotten to the point where they are so popular and people are so used to their phones and want the Apple product that it kind of feels like, they could release a new phone at pretty much whatever price they want and people are going to buy it. That kind of falls into marketing, right? And that's something that can affect the law of competition, right? But that's part of the competition, is to create, gets loyalty from customers like that, right? And there's other examples as well. I mean, you could even say, like, I think I've mentioned in class before, why do people pay so much for the newest Jordans when they come out? It's not because it's going to make you a better basketball player, right? But it's like this idea of having the Jordans. Their marketing has convinced people that it's worth it to pay that much for a shoe that might cost, $1 or $2 to produce, and then they sell it for hundreds of dollars, right? That's part of it. And we also see the law of supply and demand. Goods are produced at the lowest possible price to meet demand, right? So the economy will regulate itself. Businesses that are producing goods that people actually want are going to succeed. If you're producing a good that people don't actually have a demand for, you won't be able to sell it, and your business will go out of, right? It'll go out of business. You run out of money. If you're producing something people don't want, or if you're trying to sell something at too high of a price, people won't buy it, right? And then your business is going to go out of, you're going to go out of business, or you're going to eventually put that item on sale, clearance, those kind of things. All right. So supply and demand, producing enough of a good at the right price. Competition, producing a better good than people who produce a similar one. And the law of self-interest, that motivation doesn't have to be created, right? People will be motivated to work for their own self-interest, right? Why? And we see a quote from Adam Smith here, actually. I'll give it away. It says, "It's not from the benevolence of the butcher or the brewer or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. The butcher is not there all day producing and processing meat because he cares about everyone else so much and he wants to make sure they have food." That's Adam Smith saying that's not why he does that. He does it so he can sell the meat and make money for himself and his family, his own self-interest, right? But that then ends up working out for the people who need the meat. Okay, that's how the economy is run. This is all funneling into capitalism. It says this is the economic system in which the factors of production are privately owned and money is invested in business ventures to make a profit. Right? So factors of production, the factories, the machinery, they are private, the government, but individual people own them. That's private ownership, right? Like where private property is someone's land, usually around their house, that you're not allowed to go on. All right, but public property, like a public park, is open to anyone. And they say who owns it? Everybody, the public. That's the idea, but who really owns it? The government, right? That's why it's public property, not private. Many capitalist thinkers were against a minimum wage and improved working conditions. They felt that it would increase the cost of production. It definitely would. If you forced businesses to have a nicer facilities, that's more expensive. It increased the cost of production, which means they have to sell their goods at a higher price. If you force a minimum wage, they have to pay their workers more. Obviously, that's going to up their costs, make it harder to sell their products at the same price. They would have to raise their prices to make that possible. So supporters of pure capitalism would say it's not the government's job to tell us how much we can pay people. We'll offer what we want to offer. If people don't want it, then they shouldn't take the job. Typically, that might work. But in this situation where there were so many people who didn't have jobs and needed them, this capitalism provided an environment where the factory owners could abuse that power and abuse the supply and demand cycle, that there are more workers than there are jobs, offer people really low wages, and they don't have a choice. If they want a job at all, if they want money, they better take it. That's kind of how it was working out. Our utilitarianism, we're not really focused on for right now. It says it's a theory that government actions are only useful if they promote the greatest good for the greatest number of people. That sounds okay at first, but when you start to think about minorities and other groups that can be ignored by that, it's problematic. All right, the other one we are focused on is socialism. It says that the people own the factors of production and operate for the welfare of all. Government should plan the economy to improve the lives of everyone. Again, it's kind of like we've seen before in history, right? Where during the Dark Ages, government was weak, kings could not provide protection. So what was the obvious solution? We need more powerful government, right? We need a more powerful government that can enforce laws and protect us. And then people got that, and they didn't really want that because the all-powerful government was too powerful, and they didn't have a say in their government. So they looked for a solution to that. Again and again, same thing here. What is the problem in early industrial nations that are pure capitalists? Who is abusing the power? Well, we just said it's the factory owners. They're abusing this power. They're paying people low wages, and the workers are mistreated. Life expectancy is low. All of these problems. So how do you solve the problem? What's like the most obvious solution? If you asked like a kid and they came up with a solution, it might be, what if we just get rid of the factory owners? If there's no factory owners, then they can't abuse power anymore. And that's essentially what socialism is doing. Now, I'm not saying it's just like a simple solution that doesn't make any sense, but that at its core, it's, hey, if there's no factory owners, they can't abuse the power. That's pure socialism. Right? Obviously, we've said we have a mixed economy that's somewhere in the middle of these two today, because we do have government involvement in the economy. We have minimum wages. We have workman's comp. We have all these things provided. We have laws about safety and what is okay and what's not okay in factories. But the government doesn't own the factories. They're still private owners that can make decisions for their company. All right. So capitalism versus socialism, and this might be a good spot to come back to for your discussion question that you have at the end, right? This might help you, this and the other slide that's very similar to it. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it could be a good resource for you because the question does partially involve comparing these two things. So capitalism, individuals and business owners own the property and the means of production. People are working for their own self-interest. Consumers compete to buy the best goods at the lowest prices. This competition shapes the market by affecting what businesses are able to sell. Governments, the last one, really important. Government should not interfere in the economy because competition creates efficiency. Okay, now the mindsets of socialism. The community or the state should own the property and the means of production. The community owns it, the state owns it. Well, I mean, that is the ideal, but in the end, who really owns it is kind of the government, right? Because that's just how it goes. They're the ones regulating it. Progress results when a community of producers cooperate for the good of all. What is the motivation here? It's not that you'll get paid more if you work hard. And that's something that's hard for us to understand in America because that is typically our mindset. There is no getting paid more. No, that's not your motivation for working hard. Your motivation for working hard should be to help the community, to help others, right? And that's kind of, we're building towards communism, and we'll see that in just a second. Socialists believe that capitalist employers take advantage of workers. The community or state must act to protect the workers. And they say that an unequal distribution of wealth and material goods is unfair. A better system is to distribute goods according to each person's needs. So they're saying it's not fair for some people to have more money than others, to have more goods than others. Okay? I'm just saying it's not fair, it should be equal. Again, pure socialism, communism is one of those things that a lot of people, like when they hear it, they think that does sound good. That sounds fair. Right? It's fair. Right? If everyone's equal and everything's the same, but that's not how it ends up being in practice, and we'll see why. But the founder of this ideal, the person who's given credit for it, is Karl Marx. He wrote his ideas in the Communist Manifesto. Right? He says the upper classes owned everything, the lower classes did all the work, and this was unfair. This is Karl Marx here. He said the workers being angry over the wealth of few owners and the production, so they would eventually overthrow these owners anyways. It's inevitable. Says that communism, and this is the ideal, complete socialism, which the means of production, all land, mines, factories, railroads, and businesses would be owned by the people. No more private ownership. All right, and again, you might think, oh, that sounds good. Everyone's going to be equal. Everybody gets paid the same. There's no rich, there's no poor. What is the problem here? Well, you remove entrepreneurship, you remove private business owners. So let's say you live in a communist country. They might say the government decides, hey, these are the two shoes that we're going to produce this year. You got this working boot and you got this more athletic shoe. That's it. Those are your choices you can buy. You can have one or the other. You make the choice of which one you want, and everybody gets one pair, right? This is a simplified example, but this is pretty much how it works. You might think, oh, I can design a lot better shoe than that. I can design a shoe that looks cooler. People would want it more. I'm going to start my own shoe company and sell shoes. That is not possible. In a communist nation, you cannot start a business. Not allowed. You're not allowed to compete against the government. There is no competition. What the government decides to produce is all that you have. The one or two cars they decide to produce, that's all people can choose from. There's no other cars. You can't compete with them. They're not importing foreign cars that people can buy instead. No, it's only the ones they decide to produce. Same thing with the shoes. Like, you can't decide to compete, right? Because there's no competition. Government owns everything. Everything is publicly owned and run. The government decides what shoes to produce, what desks they're going to produce, what cars they're going to produce, everything. And that's what they make, and that's it. Right? Now, we said the motivation is not for working hard is not getting paid more. If you work in a shoe factory, we'll stick with those, and the person next to you is a real lazy worker. They come in late, hungover every day. They come in and take a nap for the first couple hours of the day. Then they wake up, go take a smoke break, come back in, finally get to work. And then they take another smoke break. By the end of the day, they've produced, we'll say, 2 pairs of shoes, right? And you're next to them. You're a motivated worker. You work all day focused on what you're supposed to be doing, and you produce 15 pairs of shoes. At the end of the day, that person gets paid the same as you. And there's no hope of you getting promoted and then getting paid more. People don't get paid more based on promotion. Right? The promotion is you're being moved up to oversee things because you're doing what's right for the community. In a communist nation, a surgeon would get paid the same amount as a janitor because everybody's equal. So then why would anyone want to go to school for all those years and study to become a surgeon? That starts to become the issue, right? Why work harder? If you're in a factory, why work harder if it's not going to make any difference? So you start to see what we've seen in history is full-on socialism doesn't really work either, just like full-on capitalism didn't work because motivation for workers becomes almost non-existent, right? And why would you go break your back working hard at this factory if it's not going to make any difference, right? And that's kind of the idea. You can see here with the calculator, a real quick example. Let's say that I decided to run the classroom like a socialist nation, like a full-on socialism or communism. And we take a test. On this first test, we'll say there are 5 students, just to make it simple. One student studies really hard, gets 100. Great, right? One student studies pretty well, pays attention for the most part in class, but maybe just kind of more crams the night before, and they end up getting 85. Good, all right? Then we'll say we have 2 students who score a 70, all right? They, pay attention here and there. They're kind of distracted by their phone in class, whatever it might be. They don't study too much, but they knew enough to just kind of scrape by and pass. And then one student who he didn't really study at all, doesn't pay attention in class. It's multiple choice, so they guess, and they somehow end up getting a 40. All right. Now, rather than giving a student a 40 or giving a student 100, we'll say it's socialism, so it needs to be equal. So instead, everybody gets a 73. Who's happy? Well, that student who failed is definitely happy. He passed. He gets a 73. Those 2 students who got a 70, they can't complain. It's a little better than what they should have gotten. Now, do you think the student who got an 85 or the student who got 100 are happy? I'm going to say definitely not, right? And now here's the real problem, though. Not just that they're unhappy, is that when the Unit 2 test comes around, you think that person who worked so hard to get 100 is going to do the same thing? I doubt it. Why would they work so hard if they were not rewarded for it? What about that student who worked pretty hard and got an 85? Would they be motivated to do that again? Probably not. So let's see them be more realistic now. Maybe we get that top student ends up getting more like an 80 because why work hard? All right, and that student who got an 85, they're probably going to drop down some too. Those 2 students who got a 70, why change anything? It's about the same. So we'll say, okay, we'll give one of them that. Again, one of them drops down a little bit. That student who got a 40 or 45, it worked out great. Same thing. It doesn't matter what I do. I'm going to pass this class. So they get even lower. All right. And then rather than a 73 being average, everybody's got a 62. It drops down, right? You see that same thing happen in communist nations in history. Like the Soviet Union, at first, were producing a lot and things were going kind of well. They're forced labor, right? and they eventually have to really start forcing people to work hard using military to like almost intimidate people to work hard, but their production still drops off significantly over time because motivation wasn't really there to work hard. So maybe the idea, at least the part of capitalism that says people's motivation to work hard is their own self-interest, might be a little more accurate than people are going to do it for the community. All right, and another one here comparing the two, that would be a great reference. I'll just leave it up here for a second. You can come back to this part of the video if you need to. Put it back for a little longer. All right, communism and capitalism compared. Adam Smith and Karl Marx. Again, neither one in its pure form has proven to be completely successful. Capitalism a lot of times leads to abuse of the working class. Full-on communism, you see a lack of motivation to work hard, and there's still, in the end, not everybody's equal. I promise the leaders in communist nations were not making the same amount as the janitors in their countries. It just didn't happen. Eventually, we start to see unions form and workers start to push for more rights. We're talking about in these industrial cities where they have industrialized and the rights for workers are so low. Reforms will start. We see child labor laws are passed in the UK and the US to create laws limiting the hours a child could work in a week. Not at first getting rid of child labor, that eventually happens, but here they're saying, hey, they got to work a little less. It's a little dangerous for them. Same thing will happen for women. They can't work 14-hour days, 6 days a week. They're going to limit that back a little bit. So now what is this really doing for the business owners? Well, they don't want to hire kids and women as much because they can't work as much. We also see the abolition of slavery. So Britain in 1865, Puerto Rico not till 1873, Brazil not till 1888. So it's a long process that was overdue, but you see that happening step by step with reform. Other reforms, better working conditions for women. Women's right to vote was granted in the U.S. in 1919. Right, so we're really just past the 100-year anniversary of that. The law was passed in 1919. Women will vote for president for the first time, 1920. There's free public education for all children is provided, which is great. We still have free public education in the U.S. so that kids can receive an education and hopefully better themselves and get a better job maybe than their parents had, or improve their quality of life going forward. Give them a much more fair shot, because during the Industrial Revolution, the only kids getting educated were the kids of the wealthy, who they didn't need their kids to work. So then in the next generation, who's going to be the wealthy again? The same families, because their kids who were educated are going to end up being more qualified and make more money than the kids who had to work in a factory from the time they were young. Right? So education for all was a good thing in that. And it also meant, well, the reason a lot of the adults supported it and voted for it is because that meant that kids could not take the jobs in the factories anymore. They weren't an option to hire. They had to be in school. By law, they had to be in school, so they couldn't take the jobs, and more jobs were available for adults. We also see a huge spike in nationalism, which we will talk about next week. This pride in your country becomes a huge factor for Germany in its formation. It's the leading factor. We see people are loyal to their nation, their country, rather than the government or a king. They are more loyal to the others around them who share a culture and history, that they're proud to be American, proud to be English, whatever it might be. Right? I think nationalism's kind of weakened, maybe for the U.S., not all parts of the world, in more recent years, but we used to be really known for this pride of being American. I think it still exists, but not as much as it probably used to. Whether that's good or not, probably not for the country, but like I said, Germany, we'll see Germany becoming a country as they go to war with France, and they kind of actually embarrass France here in what's the Franco-Prussian War early on, because they were Prussia, Austria and Prussia are the two nations that tried to dominate what was going to eventually become Germany. Prussia is the one that will, not Russia. When you see here, Prussia. Read more about that. So I'm going to skip it for right now. But a lot of bad blood is created between France and Germany because France lost that war and lost territory. Alsace and Lorraine, they lost to Prussia, which became Germany after the fact. And then just very quickly here, I'm not going to go all into detail, but just to lay the groundwork, what we'll see is the countries that have industrialized will start to take advantage of the countries that have not through imperialism, where they start taking over these countries, not as territory that they're going to live in, but they just want to control the government and the economy of these weaker areas. China, remember, historically had been a world leader. They've closed their gates. They didn't want to trade with anyone else. They were arrogant. They didn't think they needed to trade with anyone else. Now, The problem is they're unaware of industrialization. So countries like England will show up to China and force them to trade. Right? At first, they eventually agree to open their borders to England and say, okay, we'll trade with you. We don't really think we need it, so they don't give a lot of rights to the English merchants. They're kind of ignored by the Chinese people, and they're not making much money. So the English become desperate. They want goods from China. They want the wealth. So they try to come up with a good that the Chinese will actually buy. And they decide to introduce opium, which is an addictive drug. Opioids, like nowadays, that's heroin, right? Incredibly addictive, dangerous drugs. And they introduce them in China. And at first, they're selling them for dirt cheap or giving it away to get Chinese people addicted. And then they keep bringing it. And the Chinese government sees how dangerous it is. And they, demand that England stops bringing it, say we don't want opium here anymore. And England just says no. And they keep bringing it anyways. And China tries to stop them. But you have China showing up with their ships made out of wood because they have not industrialized. They don't have factories. And then England showing up with their ships made out of steel and iron, right? Who do you think has the advantage here? Obviously England. So England will win a very one-sided victory against China and then force trade agreements on China and continue to sell opium there. You see, by 1835, 12 million people in China were addicted to opium. Devastating for China's economy and just their progress overall. Really sets the stage for, the future for China, how poorly these negotiations go because they try to resist foreign influence and trade. And Japan sees what happens here, and that's why they act very differently in response. That's kind of what we're getting at. So this was the Opium War. When they tried to stop the importing of it, they could not. The Taiping Rebellion, we see of Chinese people rebelling against the Europeans and rebelling against European influence in China. It will fail. They tried to overthrow their own government because they didn't think their government was doing enough to limit foreign influence. Their government couldn't do anything about it. They didn't have much choice. All right, and then the Boxer Rebellion, poor Chinese people who resented foreigners and the fact that foreigners seemed to have more privileges than even the native Chinese did. They tried to overthrow the Chinese government also, chanting death to foreigners, tried to force the foreigners out. That will fail because they're not nearly as well equipped. They don't have the training that the foreign nations did either. All right, and you see the Boxer Rebellion here, depiction of the fighting. In the end, what I just want to mention here is what we see in Japan, and I'll see if I have time to talk about it next week, but Japan will react much differently. It's not England, but it's the US who shows up and will force Japan to trade. And rather than trying to resist, because they see what happened to China, who had been the leader in Asia, they say, okay, fine, we'll sign whatever one-sided agreement you want, and then they take the same steps that Germany did, and they start hiring foreigners to come in and teach them how to industrialize, and they will industrialize very quickly, almost overnight, right? And then we'll see within a few years, rather than being a target of imperialism like they had been, they start becoming an imperial power who's targeting other places, and they start bullying China, just like a lot of other foreign countries. They start showing up, taking land from China, forcing China to sign one-sided trade agreements because they kind of embraced industrialization rather than resisting it. And it makes a huge difference in the way their country develops. Right? Still see the impact of it very clearly today, where Japan is a very industrialized, forward nation. And China, while there is a lot of industry in China, they're also the ones, where, again, there's a reason why so much production happens in China because there's no labor laws and the wages can be incredibly low. All right. That's it for our topics today. I do want to get to the question here. This one I actually have on here. Every week we're going to have some kind of discussion question. Sometimes I'll have it up here for you to read. Sometimes I'll just ask it like last week. Right. Sometimes I'll put the question in the middle of the PowerPoint presentation, the online lecture, sometimes at the end. The first 2 times it was at the end. Next week it might be in the middle. That maybe you're actually watching rather than skipping to the question. All right, but this week, what you're answering and turning in with your other assignments, this is the quiz grade portion, so make sure you put it separately. It says compare and contrast the economic philosophies of capitalism and socialism. You have a couple side-by-side slides in here you could use for reference. Now make sure you include, though, don't just do comparison. What is the idea behind each philosophy? What inherent problems can each of these philosophies lead to? And what do they expect people to be motivated? How do they expect people to be motivated to work hard? What could they lead to? What's the expectation for why people are going to work hard for each ideal? You're not having to say what you agree with or disagree with. Do not make a chart. You are writing this out paragraph form. All right, if you want the quiz grade, that's what you need to do. All right. Thank you to those of you who joined live. Everyone else, hopefully you can watch this later on YouTube. All right. All of your assignments from this week, along with the discussion question, it should be turned in at some point on Friday when you get done with the work. Thanks so much. Talk to you guys next week.